The orc woman stood in the open doorway of the blacksmith's forge, with her fists clenched at her sides, rehearsing words she had practiced 100 times that morning, and hating every single one of them. Asking for help had never come easily to Orla Crag, not in the 15 years since she had crossed the border with nothing but a swaddled infant and the clothes on her back, and certainly not now when what she needed was so personal it made her stomach twist. The man inside worked with his back to her, hammer ringing against hot metal in a steady rhythm that spoke of decades of practice. She had lived next to his forge for 3 years, exchanged perhaps 20 words with him in all that time, and knew only that his name was Henrik, that his wife had died of fever 2 winters past, and that he kept to himself with a determination that rivaled her own. She cleared her throat. The hammering continued. She tried again, louder, and finally he turned, wiping soot from his brow with the back of one thick forearm. His face was all hard angles and weathered leather, beard shot through with gray, eyes the color of winter steel. He looked at her without surprise or welcome, waiting. "I need a favor," Orla said, the words scraping out of her throat like gravel. "For one afternoon, nothing more." Henrik set down his hammer with deliberate care. Up close she could see the scars that laced his knuckles, the way his shoulders stayed perpetually hunched as though braced for impact. A hard man who had lived a hard life. She knew the type well enough, had been that type herself for longer than she cared to count. What kind of favor? His voice was rough from disuse and smoke. "The schoolhouse is holding a family day next week. Parents are meant to attend with their children. All the parents." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "My daughter Marla is the only one without a father." The schoolmistress suggested it might be best if someone stood in for the afternoon, just for appearances. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. He looked away, back toward the forge where the metal was cooling from orange to dull red. For a long moment she thought he would refuse, that she had wasted her courage on a man who had none to spare for anyone else's troubles. "When?" he asked. "Thursday next. 2 hours, perhaps 3. You would not need to say much, only stand there and let people assume." The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. She had thought herself past shame, but apparently not. Henrik picked up his tongs, returned the metal to the coals, pumped the bellows twice. The fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows across the packed earth floor. He did not look at her when he spoke again. "I will do it." Relief and surprise warred in her chest. "You will? I said so, did I not?" He glanced at her sidelong, and she caught the faintest hint of something that might have been amusement or annoyance. Impossible to tell. "Thursday. What time?" 1 in the afternoon. "I will come to fetch you." He nodded once, already turning back to his work, and Orla fled before he could change his mind or she could say something foolish like "thank you." Gratitude felt too much like weakness, and she had been weak once long ago, when Marla's father had promised protection and belonging and delivered neither. She would not be weak again. The week passed in a blur of work. Orla took in washing and mending from half the families in the settlement, her fingers raw from lye soap and her back aching from hauling water. Marla helped after school, quiet and serious as she always was, her small tusks just beginning to show at the corners of her mouth. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with Orla's green skin and pointed ears, but a gentleness in her eyes that must have come from somewhere else. Certainly not from her mother, who had fought for every scrap of safety they possessed. "Mama, do I have to go to the family day?" Marla asked the night before, her voice barely audible over the scrubbing of cloth against the washboard. "Yes. But everyone will know he is not really my father." "Perhaps. Does that matter?" Marla was silent for a long time, her hands still in the cooling water. "I do not want you to be ashamed of me." Orla set down the shirt she was wringing out and reached for her daughter, pulling her close despite the wet and the soap. "I have never been ashamed of you, not for one moment of your life. Do you understand me?" The small head nodded against her shoulder. Orla held on longer than necessary, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, herbs and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of youth. She had crossed a continent for this child, had given up her clan, her language, her entire world. One afternoon of play-acting was nothing by comparison. Thursday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the spring sun bright enough to make her squint as she crossed the packed dirt yard between their small cabin and the forge. Henrik was already waiting, cleaned up in a way that startled her. He had trimmed his beard, exchanged his leather apron for a plain homespun shirt that strained slightly across his shoulders. He looked uncomfortable and grim, like a man heading to his own execution. "Ready?" Orla asked. "As I will ever be." They collected Marla from the cabin, and the three of them set off down the rutted road toward the schoolhouse. It sat at the center of the settlement, a sturdy timber building with real glass windows and a bell tower that the children rang at the start and end of each day. Orla had worked extra hours for months to afford the small tuition, had sewn a proper dress for Marla from fabric she could barely spare. Education mattered out here on the frontier, where the only things that separated civilization from wilderness were knowledge and determination. Other families were already gathering in the yard when they arrived. Farmers and trappers and craftsmen, their wives and children dressed in their second-best clothes, everyone smiling and talking with the easy familiarity of people who had known each other for years. Orla felt the weight of their stares as she approached, Henrik a silent presence at her side. Some of the looks were merely curious. Others carried sharper edges. The schoolmistress stood on the front steps, a thin woman named Vera Aldridge with iron-gray hair and a mouth that seemed permanently pursed in disapproval. Her gaze landed on Orla and stayed there, cold and assessing. Orla lifted her chin and kept walking. Inside, the schoolroom had been transformed. Desks pushed to the walls, children's artwork displayed on every available surface, a table laden with food and drink that the families had brought to share. Marla darted off to join the other children, and Orla found herself standing awkwardly near the door with Henrik beside her, both of them clearly uncertain what to do with their hands. "You can leave if you want," Orla said quietly. "You have done what I asked. I will stay. You do not have to." "I know." He scanned the room with the same methodical attention he likely gave to his metalwork, cataloging exits and potential threats. Old soldier habits, perhaps, or simply the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust easy gatherings. Marla returned, her face bright with something that might have been hope or terror. She reached for Orla's hand, then hesitated, glancing at Henrik. He looked down at her, his severe expression softening by some infinitesimal degree, and held out his own scarred hand. Marla took it with visible wonder, and Orla felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built so carefully she had forgotten it was even there. The afternoon unfolded with all the chaos of 24 children and their families packed into a single room. There were games and songs, recitations and small demonstrations of what the students had learned. Marla read a passage from a primer with careful precision, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Henrik watched her the entire time, his attention absolute, and when she finished he nodded once in what Orla recognized as approval. Afterward, as they stood near the refreshment table pretending to be interested in weak cider and day-old bread, the schoolmistress approached. Vera Aldridge had the look of a woman preparing for battle, spine straight and jaw set. Mrs. Cragg, she said, the honorific delivered with just enough hesitation to make clear she doubted its validity. A word, if I may. Orla set down her cup with care. Of course. Vera glanced at Henrik, clearly expecting him to retreat, but he did not move. The schoolmistress's mouth thinned further, but she pressed on. I wanted to speak with you about Marla's continued attendance. Is there a problem with her work? Her work is adequate. However, there have been concerns raised by some of the other families. Concerns about whether it is appropriate for a child of her background to remain enrolled. The words landed like stones in still water. Orla felt Henrik go rigid beside her, a sudden tension that sang through the air between them. She kept her voice level through sheer force of will. Marla has attended this school for 2 years. There have been no complaints before. The settlement is growing. New families arrive each month. Not everyone shares the same lenient views regarding integration. Vera folded her hands at her waist, the picture of prim reason. I am merely suggesting that it might be easier for everyone if alternative arrangements were made. Alternative arrangements. Orla tasted the words, found them bitter. You mean if we left? I mean that perhaps education at home might be more suitable. Henrik spoke before Orla could respond, his voice low and hard as iron. The girl reads better than half the children her age in this room. I just heard her. Are you suggesting ability no longer matters? Vera's gaze snapped to him, surprise and displeasure warring in her expression. I am suggesting that community harmony matters, Mr. Zalke. Surely you can understand the complexity of the situation. I understand you are trying to force out a child because some people are afraid of her mother's skin. Henrik took a single step forward, not threatening but immovable. Say what you mean plainly or say nothing at all. Color rose in the schoolmistress's cheeks. Around them, conversations had begun to falter as other adults noticed the confrontation. Orla wanted to pull Henrik back, to smooth over the situation before it exploded, but her tongue felt frozen. No one had ever defended Marla this way. No one had ever defended Orla herself, not once in 15 years of living among humans. There will be a meeting of the school board next week, Vera said, her voice clipped. This matter will be discussed formally. Good day. She turned and walked away, spine rigid with anger. The festive atmosphere had curdled, tension spreading through the room like spilled ink. Orla searched the crowd for Marla and found her daughter standing with 2 other girls near the window, apparently oblivious to the adult drama. Small mercies. We should go, Orla murmured. Henrik nodded. They collected Marla with minimal explanation, and the walk home passed in heavy silence. At the forge, Orla expected Henrik to disappear inside without another word, the favor discharged, the obligation complete. Instead, he stopped at the boundary between their properties and looked at her directly for the first time that day. When is the board meeting? It does not concern you. When, she told him. Wednesday evening, 7 o'clock at the schoolhouse. He nodded once and went inside, the door closing behind him with a finality that should have brought relief. Instead, Orla felt strangely hollow, as though she had lost something she had not realized she was carrying. The week that followed was taut with waiting. Orla worked with vicious focus, scrubbing clothes until her knuckles bled, mending tears with stitches so tight they could have held bone. Marla went to school each day and came home quiet, reporting nothing unusual but carrying a new wariness in her eyes that made Orla want to burn the entire settlement to ashes. She had worked so hard to give her daughter a better life than her own. Had believed that persistence and competence would be enough to earn them a place here. Apparently, she had been naive. Wednesday evening arrived cold and clear. Orla left Marla with their neighbor, an older widow named Agnes who had always treated them with distant but genuine courtesy, and made her way to the schoolhouse alone. Her best dress felt inadequate, her boots clumsy. She was acutely aware of her tusks, small though they were, and the green of her skin that no amount of covering could hide. By the time she reached the schoolhouse steps, her hands were shaking. The main room had been arranged with chairs facing a table at the front where 3 men sat. Jonas Mercer, who owned the largest farm in the area, Thomas Whitfield, the settlement's unofficial mayor and proprietor of the general store, and Father Benedict, who ministered to the small chapel and served as moral compass for the community. Vera Aldridge sat to one side, hands folded, expression serene. Perhaps 20 other adults filled the remaining seats, farmers and craftsmen and their wives, people Orla recognized from years of passing interactions. She took a seat in the back, trying to make herself small, and kept her eyes on the floor. Thomas Whitfield called the meeting to order with a few preliminary remarks about community growth and the importance of education. Then Vera stood and presented her case with the smooth precision of someone who had rehearsed extensively. The concerns of multiple families, the disruption to classroom harmony, the question of whether the school had the resources to accommodate children with special needs. She never said orc directly, but the word hung in the air anyway, unspoken and damning. We must consider what is best for the majority of our students, Vera concluded. While I have sympathy for Mrs. Cragg's situation, the needs of the many must outweigh the desires of the few. Jonas Mercer nodded along, his broad face set in what he probably imagined was judicious thought. It is a difficult situation, to be sure, but the schoolmistress raises valid points. Are there any others who wish to speak to this matter? Thomas asked, glancing around the room. The door at the back opened. Henrik Zalke walked in, still wearing his work clothes, soot staining his collar, and the entire room turned to stare. He moved to the front without acknowledging the attention, stopped before the table, and faced the 3 men with his arms crossed. I wish to speak. Thomas blinked. Mr. Zalke, we did not expect you. I am here nonetheless. Very well, you have the floor. Henrik did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The forge had given him a presence that commanded attention, a weight that filled the space around him. I have lived in this settlement for 12 years. I have shod your horses and mended your tools and asked nothing of any of you beyond fair payment for fair work. In that time, I have attended exactly 1 community gathering. He paused. Let that sink in. The family day last week, where I saw Marla Cragg read with more skill and care than most of your children manage after twice as long in school. Now, I am told you wish to expel her because her mother is orc. That is not the issue, Vera said quickly. The issue is accommodation and resources. The issue is fear. Henrik's gaze swept the room. You are afraid that allowing 1 orc child to learn alongside your own will somehow taint them, or perhaps you fear that if she succeeds, it will force you to acknowledge that orcs are no different from us in the ways that matter. Either way, you are allowing cowardice to dictate policy. Jonas Mercer bristled. Now see here, Zalke, you cannot come in here and insult this community. I am not insulting the community. I am insulting you specifically and the others who support this proposal. Henrik leaned forward slightly, his scarred hands flat on the table. Marla Cragg pays her tuition same as everyone else. She follows the rules. She does her work. If you expel her, you set a precedent that money and merit mean nothing when measured against prejudice. Is that the lesson you wish to teach your children? Silence stretched. Father Benedict cleared his throat, his lined face troubled. Mr. Zalke makes a compelling argument. I confess I am not comfortable with the idea of turning away any child who seeks learning. The practicalities remain, Vera insisted. The disruption to the classroom environment. What disruption? Henrik straightened. Name one specific incident where Marla has caused actual harm or disorder. One incident with details, not vague fears about what might happen. Vera opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words emerged. Thomas Whitfield shifted in his seat, glancing at the assembled crowd. Several people were nodding, others whispering among themselves. The momentum had changed, Orla realized with dizzying shock. One man's blunt words were actually changing minds. Perhaps we should put this to a vote, Thomas said slowly. All in favor of maintaining the current enrollment, including all students currently in good standing, raise your hands. Hands went up. Not all of them, but enough. More than enough. Orla counted through blurred vision, her breath caught somewhere in her chest. 14 in favor, only 6 against. The motion fails, Thomas announced. The school's enrollment will remain unchanged. Mrs. Cragg, your daughter is welcome to continue her studies. Orla stood on shaking legs, not trusting herself to speak. Henrik had already turned away from the table, heading for the door with the same purposeful stride that had carried him in. She followed, ignoring the stares and the scattered murmurs, and caught up with him outside in the cooling evening air. Wait. He stopped but did not turn around. Why did you do that? The question came out smaller than she intended. You barely know us. Henrik looked back over his shoulder, his profile sharp against the lantern light spilling from the schoolhouse windows. Your daughter reminds me of mine, the one I lost. He said it simply, without drama, a statement of fact. She would have been about Marla's age now. She loved to read. Something vast and wordless moved through Orla, too large for her body. Before she could find any response, Henrik continued walking, disappearing into the darkness beyond the light's reach. She stood alone in the yard for a long time, listening to the sounds of the meeting breaking up behind her, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted in some fundamental way. When she collected Marla from Agnes's house, her daughter asked how it had gone. Orla knelt down and pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. You can stay in school, really, really. Marla's small arms wrapped around her neck, fierce and tight. Over her daughter's shoulder, Orla looked in the direction of the forge, where a faint glow still showed from the banked coals. A man she barely knew had fought for them when he had no reason to, no obligation, nothing to gain. The world felt suddenly less certain, the rules she had lived by for 15 years no longer quite adequate to explain what had just happened. The following weeks passed in strange new rhythms. Henrik did not seek them out, did not knock on their door or offer further assistance. But when Orla saw him in the mornings as she hauled water from the well, he nodded. When Marla waved to him from the yard, he raised a hand in return. Small gestures, barely worth noting, yet they accumulated like snow on a roof, building towards some critical weight. Spring deepened into early summer. The frontier erupted in green growth, fields planted and tended, the settlement buzzing with the collective work of survival. Orla took on extra mending jobs to build up their savings, working by candlelight after Marla had gone to sleep, her vision blurring with exhaustion. She had always worked this way, pushing herself past reasonable limits, as though sheer effort could compensate for the disadvantage of her birth. One evening, a knock at the door startled her so badly she pricked her thumb with the needle. She opened it to find Henrik standing on her threshold, holding something wrapped in cloth. You have not eaten, he said without preamble. I ate earlier. You did not. I can see your cabin from the forge, no cook fire since morning. Orla stared at him, caught between indignation and bewilderment. Have you been watching my house? I notice things. He held out the cloth bundle. Bread and cheese. From my own supplies, before you think about refusing out of pride. She should have refused anyway. Should have closed the door and gone back to her mending, maintained the careful distance she had built around her life. Instead, she took the bundle, her fingers brushing his for an instant, rough calluses on both their hands. "Thank you." Henrik nodded and left, and Orla stood in the doorway for a long moment before closing it. The bread was still warm, the cheese sharp and good. She ate half and saved the rest for Marla's breakfast, and tried not to think too hard about what it meant that a man she barely knew paid attention to whether she lit her cook fire. The next afternoon, Marla burst through the door with unprecedented energy, waving a paper over her head. "Mama, Mama, look. The harvest fair, we have to go. Everyone is going." Orla took the notice and read it quickly. The annual harvest fair would be held in 6 weeks, a day-long celebration with competitions and performances, children's games, and a reading recital by the school students. Attendance was encouraged for all families. "We will see," Orla said automatically, "but I am supposed to read. Miss Aldridge assigned me a whole page." Marla's enthusiasm dimmed. "You do not want to go. It is not about wanting. Is it because of what happened at the board meeting?" Orla knelt down and took her daughter's hands. At 8 years old, Marla was already learning to read the world's undercurrents, to see the prejudice that shaped their lives. Part of Orla wanted to shelter her from it forever. The rest knew that was impossible. "People will stare," Orla said gently. "They will say unkind things, perhaps. I do not want you to be hurt. But if we never go anywhere, they win, do they not?" Marla's voice was so serious, so much older than her years. "Miss Aldridge told us that courage means doing hard things even when we are afraid." Out of the mouths of children. Orla pulled her daughter into a hug and blinked back the heat in her eyes. "Then we will go, and you will read beautifully." The 6 weeks, until the fair, passed faster than Orla would have liked. She threw herself into preparations, sewing a new dress for Marla from fabric she could not afford, practicing reading with her daughter every evening until the assigned passage flowed like water. Marla's excitement was contagious, lighting up their small cabin with an energy that had been absent too long. 3 days before the fair, Henrik appeared at the door again. This time he carried a length of worked metal, formed into an intricate shape Orla could not immediately identify. He handed it to Marla, who had answered the knock. "What is it?" Marla asked, turning it over in her hands. "A puzzle. You fold it like this." Henrik demonstrated, the metal bending at hidden joints, and like this, makes different shapes depending on how you arrange it. Marla's eyes went wide. "You made this. It is just scrap metal, but I thought you might like it." "I love it." Marla clutched it to her chest, then looked up at Henrik with sudden intensity. "Are you coming to the harvest fair?" He hesitated, glancing past her to where Orla stood watching. "I had not planned on it." "You should come. I am reading in the recital. You could watch." "Marla," Orla said quietly, "Mr. Zalke is busy." "I could come for the recital," Henrik said, the words slow and deliberate as though he was testing their weight, "if it would not be an imposition." "It would not," Marla said before Orla could respond. "We want you there." Orla met Henrik's gaze over her daughter's head and saw something in his face she could not quite name, a vulnerability that sat strangely on such a hard man. She should discourage this, whatever this was. Should protect both Marla and herself from the risk of dependence, of expecting things from someone who owed them nothing. But Marla was smiling with uncomplicated joy, and Henrik looked less alone than he had at any point since his wife's death, and Orla found herself nodding instead. "The recital starts at 2 in the afternoon. I will be there." True to his word, Henrik arrived at their cabin shortly before 2 on the day of the fair. He had cleaned up again, wearing what must have been his only good shirt, beard neatly trimmed. Marla greeted him with the easy affection of a child, who had already claimed him as hers in some fundamental way, chattering about the fair as they walked toward the central green, where the celebrations were concentrated. The settlement had transformed. Banners hung between buildings, tables groaned with food and drink. Music drifted from a makeshift stage where local musicians played cheerful reels. Children ran wild, faces sticky with honey cakes, while adults stood in clusters talking and laughing. It should have been welcoming. Instead, Orla felt hyper-aware of every glance that turned their way, every conversation that paused as they passed. The reading recital took place under a large tent near the schoolhouse. Families packed the space, sitting on benches or standing at the back, and Orla found herself positioned between Henrik and the tent's edge, Marla having gone to join the other students at the front. Henrik's presence beside her was steadying, his bulk blocking some of the stairs, his silence somehow more comforting than words would have been. The students read in order of age. Marla was fifth, her small frame dwarfed by the makeshift podium, but her voice carried clear and strong as she recited a passage from a history text about the founding of the settlement. She stumbled once, caught herself, continued without panic. When she finished, applause rippled through the crowd, polite if not enthusiastic. Orla clapped until her palms stung, and Henrik beside her did the same, his face set in what might have been pride. Afterward, as they filed out of the tent into the afternoon sunshine, Marla ran to them with her face glowing. "Did you hear me? I did not forget any words. You were perfect," Orla said. "Mr. Zalke, did you think I did well?" Henrik crouched down to her level, putting them eye to eye. "I have heard grown scholars read worse. You should be proud." Marla threw her arms around his neck in an impulsive hug. Henrik went rigid with surprise, then slowly brought his arms up to return the embrace, his large hands awkward and gentle on her small back. When Marla pulled away, he stood quickly, clearing his throat, not looking at either of them. "Should we see the rest of the fair?" Orla suggested, her voice only slightly unsteady. They wandered through the festivities, Marla pulling them from booth to booth, pointing out crafts and curiosities. Henrik bought her a ribbon for her hair from one vendor, waving off Orla's protest. They watched the axe throwing competition, the pie judging, the impromptu dancing that broke out when the musicians struck up a particularly lively tune. People still stared, but the hostility Orla had expected never materialized. Perhaps Henrik's presence deflected it. Perhaps the community had genuinely begun to accept them. She was not naive enough to believe the latter entirely, but she could hope. As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they started back toward home. Marla walked between them, each hand held by an adult, chattering about everything she had seen. Orla caught Henrik's eye over her daughter's head and found him already looking at her, his expression soft in the fading light. "Thank you for coming," Orla said quietly. "I wanted to." 3 simple words, but they resonated in her chest like a bell. When they reached the space between their homes, Marla hugged Henrik again, then darted inside to get ready for bed. Orla lingered, suddenly uncertain. "She has grown attached to you," Orla said. "And you?" Henrik's gaze was direct, unflinching. "What about you?" The question hung between them, dangerous in its honesty. Orla thought about the walls she had built, the determination never to need anyone, the fierce independence that had kept her and Marla alive, but also profoundly isolated. She thought about Henrik's hands on her daughter's shoulders, steadying and sure. About the way he had defended them to the school board without being asked, the way he noticed when she forgot to eat, the way he looked at her now as though her answer actually mattered. "I do not know," she said finally. I have spent so long not allowing attachment, I am not sure I remember how, neither do I. Henrik took a half step closer. But I would like to try, if you would let me. Orla's breath caught. Before she could formulate a response, Marla called from inside the cabin, needing help with her night clothes. The moment broke and Henrik stepped back, the vulnerability shuddering behind his usual reserve. Think about it, he said. No pressure. I am next door whenever you are ready. He left, and Orla went inside to help her daughter, her mind spinning. That night she lay awake long after Marla had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to untangle the knot of fear and longing in her chest. She had been alone for so long. Had told herself it was safer that way, simpler, the only reliable path. But watching Marla's joy at the fair, feeling the warmth of being part of something even briefly, had cracked that certainty. Maybe safety was not the same as living. Maybe she owed her daughter more than mere survival. Maybe she owed herself more too. The next morning, Orla woke with a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. She got Marla off to school, finished her washing jobs with unusual speed, and then did something she had not done since arriving at the settlement 15 years ago. She baked. The bread was not fancy, just simple wheat loaves with a bit of honey she had been saving, but she shaped them with care and baked them until the cabin filled with warmth and the smell of yeast and grain. When they were cool enough, she wrapped one in cloth and crossed the yard to the forge. Henrik was working metal as always, the hammer's rhythm steady and hypnotic. This time she did not wait for him to notice. She walked right in, set the wrapped loaf on his workbench and spoke over the noise. I thought about it. He set down the hammer immediately, turning to face her. Soot streaked his face, sweat dampening his shirt, but his attention was absolute. And I would like to try, too, if the offer still stands. Something like relief washed over his features. He wiped his hands on his apron, took a step toward her, stopped as though uncertain how to proceed. Orla closed the distance herself, reached for his hand, felt the heat of him through the calluses and scars. His fingers closed around hers, careful and strong. The offer stands, Henrik said. It will always stand, for as long as you want it. They stood that way for a long moment, the forge fire crackling behind them, the world narrowed down to the point of contact between their hands. Then Orla smiled, small and tentative, and Henrik smiled back, and it felt like the beginning of something neither of them had planned but both desperately needed. The following months unfolded with the slow, steady progression of seasons. Summer deepened, crops growing tall in the fields, and Henrik began joining them for meals several times a week. He was not a talkative man, but he listened with complete attention when Marla recounted her school days, asked thoughtful questions, offered quiet praise. With Orla, he was equally attentive but more hesitant, as though afraid of presuming too much. She found herself watching him when he was not looking, noticing the way he moved, the rare flash of humor in his eyes, the gentleness with which he handled fragile things. One evening as they sat outside watching the stars emerge, Marla asleep inside, Henrik told her about his wife. Her name had been Anna. They had married young, built a life together through sheer determination and love. She had died quickly when the fever took her, too fast for him to do anything but hold her at the end. Their daughter, Elena, had been stillborn 5 years before that, and Anna had never quite recovered from the grief. I thought I was done, Henrik said quietly. Thought I would work until I could not anymore, then die. No plan beyond that. But then I heard Marla read at that first family day, and it was like Elena's voice in my head, like she was telling me not to waste what was left. Orla reached for his hand in the darkness, laced her fingers through his. I am glad you listened. So am I. They sat in comfortable silence, the night air cool against their skin, and Orla felt something settle in her chest that had been restless and displaced for 15 years. Not quite peace, but its first tentative edges. Autumn arrived with its annual rush of harvest work. The entire settlement turned out to bring in the crops, everyone pitching in regardless of profession. Orla worked in the fields alongside farmers' wives, her orc strength allowing her to match their pace, despite having no experience with such labor. Henrik helped with equipment repairs, setting up a temporary forge at the edge of the largest field. Marla and the other children ran errands, carried water, generally got underfoot in the way of young ones everywhere. On the last day of harvest, when the final wagon had been loaded and everyone was exhausted and giddy with completion, someone started singing. Others joined in, voices blending in old working songs, and before long people were dancing in the stubbled field, passing around jugs of cider and beer. Orla found herself swept into a circle dance, Henrik's hand solid in hers, Marla laughing as she spun nearby. The community that had nearly expelled her daughter months ago now included them without question, and the change was dizzying. Later, walking home in the twilight, Marla between them as had become their custom, the little girl spoke with the sudden seriousness that sometimes overtook her. "Are you going to marry Mr. Zalke, Mama?" Orla nearly tripped over her own feet. Henrik's hand tightened on Marla's, but he said nothing, waiting for her response. "That is a complicated question," Orla managed. "It seems simple to me. You love each other, do you not, Marla?" "It is all right if you do, I want you to." Marla looked up at Henrik with complete trust. "I would like it if you were my real father, not just for school events." Henrik stopped walking, crouched down to Marla's level. His voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. "I would be honored. But that is something your mother and I need to discuss. Privately. Can you give us time?" Marla nodded solemnly. "But not too much time. The winter pageant is in 2 months, and I want you to be there as my real father, not just pretending." She ran ahead toward the cabin, leaving the 2 adults standing in the road staring at each other. Orla felt heat rising in her cheeks, embarrassment and hope and fear all tangled together. "She is not wrong," Henrik said carefully, "about how I feel about you." "Henrik, you do not have to say anything. I know it is complicated. Our histories, your situation, what people will think." He stood, faced her fully. "But I need you to know that I am not going anywhere. Whether we marry or not, whether you ever feel the same or not, I am here, for both of you." Orla looked at this man who had entered her life by accident, who had stayed by choice, who had proven himself steady and true in ways she had not known to hope for. She thought about trust, about risk, about the difference between surviving and actually living. "I am afraid," she said quietly. "I've been alone so long. What if I am no good at this? Then we figure it out together." Henrik reached for her hand. "I am afraid too, but I think we can be afraid together and still build something good." The simplicity of it undid her. Orla stepped forward and kissed him, tentative at first, then with growing certainty as his arms came around her. He tasted of wood smoke and autumn air, solid and real against her. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his chest and let herself be held. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. Yes to trying. Yes to figuring it out together. Yes to whatever this is becoming." She felt more than heard his relieved exhale. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, gentle despite his strength. They stood that way until Marla called from the cabin doorway, demanding to know what was taking so long. And then they walked the rest of the way home together, not as neighbors or friends or even just lovers, but as something deeper and more lasting. The engagement, when they announced it the following week, caused less stir than Orla had anticipated. Most of the settlement had apparently seen it coming, and those who might have objected had learned from the school board incident that Henrik would not tolerate interference. They set a date for late autumn, after harvest, but before the worst of winter set in. A simple ceremony at the chapel with a celebration afterward. Marla threw herself into preparations with the single-minded intensity only an 8-year-old could muster. She insisted on having a role in the ceremony, helped Orla sew her wedding dress, drew elaborate pictures of what their family would look like. Her joy was infectious, lighting up even the routine drudgery of daily work. One afternoon, about a month before the wedding, Vera Aldridge appeared at Orla's door. Orla tensed automatically, expecting some new objection or complication, but the schoolmistress looked uncomfortable rather than confrontational. "May I come in?" Orla stepped aside, mystified. Vera entered, glanced around the modest cabin, and remained standing near the door. "I wanted to apologize," Vera said abruptly, "for my behavior at the board meeting, for the things I said about Marla." Orla stared at her, momentarily speechless. "I was afraid," Vera continued. "Afraid of losing my position if I did not appease certain families, afraid of change, afraid of being seen as weak." She met Orla's gaze directly. "But I was wrong. Marla is one of my best students. She deserves better than a teacher who cannot defend her." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want to ask your permission to attend your wedding. And because I wanted you to hear it from me, not as a public gesture, but as a genuine acknowledgement of fault." Orla considered the woman before her, the pride it must have cost to make this admission. She thought about Marla, who had taught herself to be brave even when she was afraid, about Henrik, who had defended them without hesitation, about the way healing sometimes required accepting imperfect offerings. "You may attend," Orla said, "and thank you for saying what you did." Vera nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Marla is lucky to have you, and Mr. Zalke. I hope you will all be very happy." After she left, Orla sat for a long time thinking about the strangeness of this world, the way people could surprise you even when you had given up expecting it. She thought about the girl she had been 15 years ago, desperate and alone, and the woman she had become, still fierce but no longer isolated. The journey between those 2 points had been hard, but maybe that was what made arriving here matter. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn afternoon with the trees at their peak color, the world painted in shades of gold and crimson. The chapel was small but packed, most of the settlement turning out to witness the ceremony. Orla wore a dress of deep green that brought out the natural tone of her skin, her hair braided with late wildflowers that Marla had gathered. Henrik stood at the front in his best clothes, freshly shaved, looking terrified and determined in equal measure. Father Benedict conducted the service with quiet dignity. The vows were traditional, simple words about love and loyalty and partnership. Orla's voice shook only slightly when she spoke them, her hand steady in Henrik's. When the priest pronounced them married, Henrik kissed her with a tenderness that made her throat tighten, and the chapel erupted in applause. The celebration afterward took over the village green, tables laden with contributed food, musicians playing dance tunes that grew progressively more energetic as the evening wore on and the ale flowed. Orla danced with Henrik, with Marla, with several of the farmers who had become something like friends. At one point she found herself standing at the edge of the festivities, catching her breath, and realized she was happy. Not just content or satisfied, but genuinely, deeply happy in a way she had thought lost to her forever. Henrik appeared at her elbow, offering a cup of cider. "Tired, overwhelmed," she admitted. "In a good way. We can leave whenever you want." "Not yet. Let Marla enjoy this a little longer." She watched her daughter teaching some of the younger children a clapping game, her face alight with joy. She has waited for this, for a family. She has always had one, Henrik said. You have given her everything that matters. Now she has more. She has you too. He slipped an arm around her waist, pulled her close against his side. They stood together watching their daughter play, two people who had been broken in different ways, finding wholeness in each other and the child they both loved. The winter that followed was the coldest in years, snow falling early and often, the world transformed into a landscape of white. Henrik moved into the cabin formally, expanding it with a new room that he built himself during the brief clear days between storms. Marla delighted in having him there constantly, dragging him into games and stories, falling asleep against his shoulder in the evenings while he read aloud from whatever book they had borrowed from the schoolhouse. The winter pageant arrived in late December, a celebration of the solstice with songs and short plays performed by the students. Marla had a speaking role, 3 whole lines as an angel in the nativity scene. She practiced relentlessly, driving both adults to distraction with her dedication. On the night of the pageant, the schoolhouse was warm and bright, candles blazing on every surface, families packed shoulder to shoulder. Orla and Henrik sat in the front row, having arrived early to claim the spots, and watched their daughter take the stage in her white robe with tinsel wings that caught the light. When Marla spoke her lines, her voice carried clear and confident through the room. She looked directly at them as she finished, and her smile was radiant, a child who knew beyond doubt that she was loved and supported. In that moment, Orla understood that everything she had endured, every hardship and humiliation and lonely night, had been leading to this. To giving her daughter the childhood she herself had never had, full of security and opportunity and hope. Henrik's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezed gently. She squeezed back, blinking against the heat in her eyes, and they watched together as the pageant unfolded. Afterward, in the milling crowd, several people approached to congratulate them on Marla's performance. Orla recognized some of them as families who had supported her expulsion months ago, but she accepted their words with grace. People could change. She was proof of that herself. As they walked home through the snow, Marla chattered about the pageant, about what the other children had done, about the refreshments served afterward. Henrik carried her the last stretch when her energy flagged, her head resting on his shoulder, and Orla walked beside them feeling more content than she had thought possible. Inside, they settled Marla into bed, listening to her drowsy recap of the evening until she finally drifted off mid-sentence. Henrik pulled the blankets up around her, touched her forehead gently, then followed Orla out to the main room. "Thank you," Orla said quietly, "for staying, for all of it." Henrik cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "I am the one who should be thanking you. You gave me a reason to live again. Both of you did." "We are family now," Orla said, "all 3 of us, really and truly." "Really and truly," Henrik agreed and kissed her, slow and deep and full of promise. They stood wrapped in each other while the fire burned low, snow falling steadily outside, the world reduced to the warmth of their cabin and the sleeping child in the next room. It was not the life Orla had imagined all those years ago when she had fled across the border with an infant in her arms. It was infinitely better. Winter gradually loosened its grip. The snow melted, revealing the brown earth beneath. Spring arrived in a rush of green growth, the frontier coming back to life after months of dormancy. Henrik's forge stayed busy with plows needing repair and new tools commissioned. Orla took on more mending work, saving toward the future with an optimism that still felt strange and new. Marla continued to thrive at school, her confidence growing with each passing month. She made friends among the other children, invited them to the cabin for games and treats, became simply another student rather than the orc girl who did not belong. The transformation was subtle but complete, and Orla marveled at it even as she worked to ensure it remained stable. In early spring, the schoolmistress announced another event, a reading competition, open to all students, with the winner receiving a proper book of their own choosing from the general store. Marla came home with the announcement clutched in her fist, determination written across her small face. "I am going to win," she declared. "I am going to read better than anyone." Henrik looked up from the harness he was mending, one eyebrow raised. "Confidence is good, but what matters is doing your best, not beating others." "I know, but I want the book, and I want to show them that I can do it." Over the following weeks, Marla prepared with an intensity that reminded Orla of herself. She read everything she could get her hands on, practiced her pronunciation and pacing, asked Henrik and Orla to listen and critique her endlessly. They obliged, offering gentle feedback and copious encouragement, watching their daughter push herself toward a goal that mattered to her. The competition took place on a mild spring evening, the schoolhouse once again transformed into a gathering space. Students read in age groups, youngest to oldest, from texts selected by the schoolmistress. Marla's group included 6 children, all 8 or 9 years old, all visibly nervous. When Marla's turn came, she walked to the front with her head high, took the book Miss Aldridge handed her, and began to read. The passage was complex, filled with difficult vocabulary and long sentences, but Marla navigated it with barely a stumble. Her voice was clear and expressive, bringing the words to life in a way that commanded attention. When she finished, the applause was immediate and genuine. The other children read well too, but when Miss Aldridge announced the winner, it was Marla's name she called. Orla felt Henrik's hand grip hers almost painfully as their daughter walked forward to accept her prize, a bound volume of folk tales that she clutched to her chest with reverent joy. That night, Marla fell asleep with the book under her pillow, her face peaceful. Orla and Henrik stood in the doorway of her room watching her breathe in the candlelight. "She is going to do great things," Henrik murmured. "I can feel it." "Because we gave her the chance," Orla said. "Because you stood up for her when it mattered. Because you fought for her every day of her life. I just helped with one battle." Orla turned into his arms, rested her head against his chest. "We are a good team, the best." They held each other in the quiet cabin, the spring night alive with sound beyond the walls, and Orla thought about the strange paths life took, the unexpected grace that could emerge from desperation. She had needed Henrik for one afternoon, to fill a role at a single school event. He had stayed for everyone after, had become father to her daughter and partner to herself, had woven himself into the fabric of their lives until she could not imagine existence without him. Summer arrived in full force, hot and bright. The settlement's fields flourished, the work hard but rewarding. Orla and Henrik fell into easy rhythms, the give and take of partnership becoming second nature. They argued occasionally, usually about minor things like how much firewood to lay in or whether Marla should be allowed to walk to school alone. But they had learned to talk through disagreements rather than let them fester. One July afternoon, as Orla hung washing in the yard and Henrik worked in the forge, a wagon rolled into the settlement. Not unusual in itself, as traders and new settlers passed through regularly, but something about this one caught her attention. The driver was orc, and the woman beside him was human, and in the back sat 3 children of mixed heritage, their skin ranging from pale green to muted olive. The wagon stopped near the general store, and the family climbed down, looking around with the wariness of newcomers assessing unfamiliar territory. Orla found herself walking toward them before she had consciously decided to, drawn by curiosity and a strange sense of kinship. "Welcome," she said as she approached. "Are you passing through or planning to stay?" The orc man turned to her, his expression cautious. "Considering staying if the settlement will have us. We have been looking for a place that might be open to a mixed family." "This settlement will have you," Orla said with certainty. "I am Orla Zailki. My daughter and I are orc, my husband is human. We have lived here several years now." Relief washed over both the man and the woman. "I am Grath Morrow, this is my wife Sarah and our children." He gestured to the three youngsters. "We heard this area was growing, that maybe there was room for people like us." "There is room," Orla confirmed. "It has not always been easy, but the community is learning. There is a school for the children, good farmland available for homesteading, work for those with skills." Sarah Morrow smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "We have been traveling for 3 months, turned away from half a dozen places. To hear you say that." "Come," Orla said. "Let me introduce you to some people. My husband is the blacksmith. He can point you toward those you will need to meet. And you should speak with the schoolmistress about enrollment for your children." As she led the family toward the forge, she caught Henrik's eye. He read the situation instantly, set down his tools, and came to greet the newcomers with his usual gruff courtesy. Within an hour, he had introduced the Morrows to the mayor, helped them identify a potential homestead plot, and arranged for them to stay in the chapel's spare room until they could build their own shelter. That evening, after the Morrows had been settled and Marla was in bed, Orla sat outside with Henrik watching the stars emerge. She felt strange, unsettled in a way she could not quite articulate. "What are you thinking?" Henrik asked. "That maybe things are changing. That we might not be the only ones anymore." She looked at him. "Does that scare you?" "A little," he admitted. "Change always does, but mostly I am glad. Glad that Marla will grow up seeing other mixed families. Glad that what we have might become normal instead of exceptional. I never thought I would see that, not in my lifetime. You made it possible. By staying, by fighting, by refusing to accept that there was no place for you here." He reached for her hand. "You changed this settlement just by being in it. The Morrows are proof of that." Orla leaned against his shoulder, letting his warmth seep into her. The future felt suddenly vast and uncertain, full of possibilities she had not allowed herself to imagine. More orc families, more children like Marla growing up with opportunities their parents had never had. A slow transformation of the frontier from a place of rigid boundaries to something more fluid and hopeful. She fell asleep that night thinking about change, about legacy, about the small acts of courage that accumulated into something larger than any individual life. The rest of the summer passed in pleasant routine. The Morrows settled on their homestead plot with help from several neighbors, Henrik among them. Their children enrolled in school alongside Marla, and the girl came home delighted to have other students who understood her mixed heritage. The settlement absorbed the new family with relative ease, as though Orla and Henrik's presence had indeed paved the way for acceptance. In late August, Marla turned 9. They celebrated with a small party, inviting several of her school friends and their families. Orla baked a honey cake, Henrik crafted a small knife for her with a carved handle, and the afternoon passed in laughter and games. Watching her daughter surrounded by friends, accepted and happy, Orla felt the last lingering shadows of her old fears dissolve. That night, after the guests had left and Marla had been tucked into bed surrounded by her new gifts, Henrik drew Orla outside into the cooling evening. "I have something for you too," he said. "It is not my birthday, I know, but I wanted to mark the occasion anyway." He pulled a small object from his pocket, pressed it into her palm. Orla looked down at the worked metal, instantly recognizing Henrik's craftsmanship. It was a brooch in the shape of a flowering vine, intricate and delicate despite being forged from iron. The detail was extraordinary, each leaf and petal distinct, the whole piece flowing with organic grace. "Henrik, this is beautiful. It reminded me of you, strong at the core but growing into something unexpected and lovely." He smiled, rare and genuine. "I wanted you to have something that reflected how I see you." Orla clutched the brooch to her chest, overwhelmed by the gesture and all it represented. This man who had entered her life as a reluctant favor had become her anchor, her partner, the father her daughter deserved. He saw her not as an orc to be tolerated or a burden to be managed, but as herself, complete and valuable. She kissed him with all the gratitude and love she could not quite voice, and he held her close, and the night wrapped around them soft and warm. Autumn arrived once more, the year coming full circle. The harvest was good, the winter stores full, and the settlement prepared for the cold months ahead with practiced efficiency. Marla thrived in school, her reading ability now far beyond her age level, her confidence unshakable. The Morrows integrated fully into the community, their farm showing early promise. Other families inquired about settling in the area, drawn by word that the frontier town accepted mixed marriages and orc residents. The school board, now chaired by Thomas Whitfield after Jonas Mercer had moved to a larger town, formally adopted a policy of non-discrimination in student enrollment. The decision passed with minimal debate, a sign of how far the community had shifted. Vera Aldridge, present at the meeting, spoke in favor of the policy, citing Marla and the Morrow children as examples of what could be achieved when prejudice was set aside. When Orla heard about the policy, she cried. Henrik held her while she sobbed out years of accumulated tension and fear, the weight of always having to fight for basic dignity finally lifting. Marla, witnessing her mother's tears, climbed into her lap and hugged her fiercely, and Henrik wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stayed that way until Orla's breathing steadied. "It is really going to be different," Orla said wonderingly. "For her, for any children who come after. They will not have to fight the way I did." "You made that possible," Henrik said. "Do not forget that." In October, the school announced yet another event, a fall festival with performances by each grade level, carnival games, and a community feast. Marla had a role in her class's play, and she insisted that both parents attend, as had become their custom. The day of the festival was perfect, crisp and clear, the trees ablaze with color. Orla and Henrik walked to the schoolhouse hand in hand, Marla skipping ahead of them, and found the grounds already crowded with families. Children ran everywhere, their shouts of laughter creating a joyful cacophony. Adults clustered in groups talking and laughing, sharing cider and gossip in equal measure. The plays were performed on a temporary stage in the schoolyard. Marla's class presented a comedy about bumbling farmers trying to catch a clever rabbit, and Marla played one of the farmers with exaggerated seriousness that had the audience roaring with laughter. Afterward, flushed with success, she dragged her parents to every game booth and food stall, determined to experience everything. At one point, as Henrik helped Marla aim at a target in a ball-throwing game, Orla found herself approached by Sarah Morrow. The human woman smiled warmly, her youngest child balanced on her hip. "Your family looks happy," Sarah said. "We are," Orla agreed. "It took time, but yes, we are happy. Grath and I wanted to thank you for helping us when we arrived, for making us feel welcome. It meant everything. I only did what I wished someone had done for me when I first came here." Orla watched Henrik lift Marla up so she could reach the top prize shelf. "But I am glad we could help. How are you settling in?" "Better than we dared hope. The farm is coming together, the children love school, and people have been kind." Sarah shifted her baby to her other hip. "We heard about what you went through with the school board, what your husband did to defend you. It gave us courage to try settling here." Orla felt the familiar tightness in her throat, the gratitude that still sometimes overwhelmed her when she thought about Henrik's actions that night. "He is a good man. We are lucky to have him." "He is lucky to have you too," Sarah said. "And Marla." "Family is what you make of it, not what blood dictates." They talked for a while longer, swapping stories and advice, and by the time they parted, Orla felt the bond of genuine friendship forming. Another small miracle in a year that had been full of them. As evening approached and the festival wound down, families began drifting toward home. Orla, Henrik, and Marla walked back through the gathering dusk, Marla between them holding both their hands, chattering about the festival with undiminished energy. "This was the best day ever," Marla declared. "Can we do it again next year?" "We will do it every year," Henrik promised. "For as long as you want." "Forever, then." Henrik laughed, a sound that still startled Orla with its rarity and warmth. "Forever it is." At home, they settled into their evening routine with the ease of long practice. Marla washed up and changed into her night clothes, then curled up with her book while Orla prepared a light supper and Henrik banked the fire. They ate together at the small table, talking about the day, making plans for tomorrow, simply existing in each other's presence. Later, after Marla had finally consented to sleep, Orla and Henrik sat together near the fire. He had his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, comfortable and content. "You ever think about having more children?" Henrik asked quietly. The question surprised her, though perhaps it should not have. "Sometimes." "Do you?" "I think about it. About what it would be like to have a child with you from the beginning, to go through all those stages together." He paused. "But I also know Marla is mine in every way that matters. If she is our only child, I am more than satisfied." "I would like more," Orla admitted. "I always imagined having several children, though circumstances never allowed it, but I am not young anymore, and childbearing for orcs is harder as we age. We have time to decide. No rush." Henrik pressed a kiss to her temple. "Whatever happens, we have each other and Marla. That is already more than I thought I would ever have again." Orla turned in his arms, kissed him properly, deep and lingering. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs stroking her cheeks, and the kiss deepened further. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Orla rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she said, the words still new enough to feel momentous. "I should say it more often." "I love you too, every day, even when I do not say it." They stayed up late that night, talking and kissing and simply being together, the fire burning low and the world outside quiet under the stars. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary life, and it was perfect. Winter approached again, the cycle of seasons continuing. Henrik expanded the cabin further, adding a proper workshop attached to one side where he could do fine metalwork during the coldest months. Marla helped with the construction, learning basic carpentry alongside her father, her small hands eager and increasingly skilled. Orla watched them work together and felt a deep satisfaction, knowing her daughter was learning practical skills that would serve her regardless of what path she chose in life. The winter pageant came around once more, Marla now in a larger role as one of the narrators. She practiced her lines with Henrik, drilling her patiently on pronunciation and projection. On the night of the performance, she was flawless, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed schoolhouse, her presence commanding despite her small stature. Afterward, as they bundled up for the walk home through light snow, Miss Aldridge approached them with a thoughtful expression. "Mrs. Zalke, Mr. Zalke, might I have a word?" They stopped. Marla pressed close against Henrik's side for warmth. Vera looked at the girl with obvious fondness before addressing the adults. "I wanted to discuss Marla's education going forward. She is exceeding the curriculum I can provide here. In another year or two, she will need more advanced instruction." Orla's heart sank. "Are you saying she needs to leave?" "Not leave the settlement, no. But I would like to propose a more individualized program for her, drawing on resources from the Regional Educational Cooperative. It would mean some additional work for all of us, but I believe Marla has the potential to pursue higher education eventually, perhaps even teaching herself one day." Relief and pride warred in Orla's chest. "We would be honored. Whatever she needs, we will find a way to provide." "She is a credit to both of you," Vera said warmly. And to herself, "I am glad I was able to overcome my initial prejudice and truly see her." After the schoolmistress left, Henrik scooped Marla up and spun her around despite her protests that she was too old for such treatment. "Did you hear that? You are going to be a scholar." "I am going to be whatever I want," Marla corrected, but she was grinning. "Maybe a scholar, maybe a blacksmith like you, maybe something else entirely." "Whatever you choose, you will be extraordinary," Orla said, "because you work hard and never give up." "I learned that from you, Mama." They walked home through the softly falling snow, and Orla thought about legacy, about what children learned from their parents beyond formal lessons. Marla had learned perseverance and dignity and the courage to claim her place in the world. Those lessons would serve her far better than any academic curriculum, however advanced. The years began to blur together in the way of happy times, each season bringing its own rhythms and joys. Marla grew from child to young adolescent, still small for her age but fierce and determined. She excelled in her individualized studies, devouring books on history and mathematics and natural philosophy. She also spent hours in Henrik's workshop, learning metalwork with the same intensity she brought to academics, her hands growing skilled at the forge. More mixed families settled in the area, drawn by the town's growing reputation for tolerance. The orc population remained a minority, but no longer vanishingly small. A proper school building was constructed to handle the growing number of students, and Vera Aldridge hired an assistant teacher to help manage the expanded enrollment. The settlement prospered, its fields productive, its craftsmen skilled, its sense of community strong. Through it all, Orla and Henrik remained the center of Marla's world. They attended every school event, every performance, every small milestone. Henrik never missed an opportunity to be present, and Orla never took for granted what his consistency meant to their daughter. The man who had agreed to stand in for one afternoon had become the most reliable constant in both their lives. On Marla's 12th birthday, as they celebrated with the now traditional honey cake and small gathering of friends, Orla found a quiet moment alone with her daughter. "Are you happy?" Orla asked. Marla looked at her with surprised amusement. "Of course I am, Mama. Why would you ask?" "Because I want to be sure that you do not feel you missed out on anything by having the childhood you had." "I have the best family," Marla said simply. "I have a mother who fights for me and a father who stands beside us. I have friends and school and a whole life ahead of me. What could I possibly be missing?" Orla pulled her daughter into a hug, blinking hard against tears. Marla tolerated it for a moment before squirming away with adolescent embarrassment, but she was smiling, and that was enough. That spring, a letter arrived addressed to Marla. It bore the seal of the Regional Academy, a boarding school 50 miles distant that served gifted students from across the frontier territories. Inside was an invitation to attend their summer session, a 2-month intensive program for advanced students. The letter praised Marla's academic record and suggested she would thrive in their more rigorous environment. Marla read the letter 3 times, her face cycling through excitement and uncertainty. "What do you think?" she asked her parents. "What do you think?" Henrik countered. "It is your education. I want to go, I think, but I have never been away from home before." "Then maybe this is a good time to try," Orla said gently. "You will be safe there and learning things we cannot teach you here, and you will come back at the end of summer. You would let me go?" "We would be proud to let you go," Henrik said, "though we will miss you terribly." Marla threw herself at both of them, hugging with fierce intensity. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears and anticipation. "I am going to do it. I am going to go and learn everything I can, and then I will come back and tell you all about it." The weeks before her departure passed too quickly. They prepared her trunk, sewed new clothes, made lists of everything she might need. When the day came to put her on the coach that would carry her to the academy, Orla found herself fighting the urge to pull her daughter back and refuse to let her leave. "She will be fine," Henrik murmured, reading her thoughts as he so often did. "She is strong and smart and capable. We raised her to be independent, I know, but she is still my baby. She will always be that, no matter how old or accomplished she becomes." They watched the coach until it disappeared around the bend in the road, then walked home hand in hand, the cabin suddenly feeling much too large and quiet. That night they sat together by the fire, not speaking much, simply taking comfort in each other's presence. The summer passed slowly without Marla's energy filling the cabin. Letters arrived weekly, full of descriptions of classes and fellow students and new ideas that excited her. She was thriving, clearly, but she also missed home, missed them. Orla read each letter multiple times, savoring every detail, counting the days until her daughter's return. When Marla finally came home at summer's end, she had grown taller, her face leaner, her bearing more mature. But she was still their Marla, still throwing herself into their arms with unrestrained joy, still chattering about everything she had learned. The cabin filled with life again, and Orla felt the last tightness in her chest ease. "Did you enjoy it?" Henrik asked over dinner that first night. "It was amazing. Hard, but amazing. I learned so much." Marla's enthusiasm was infectious, "and they want me to come back next summer and possibly attend full-time when I am older." "How do you feel about that?" Orla asked carefully. "I do not know yet. I loved it, but I also missed home more than I expected." Marla looked between her parents. "Can I decide later, after I have had time to think about it?" "Of course," Henrik said. "This is your life, Marla. We will support whatever choice you make." The autumn term started, and Marla returned to her studies with renewed vigor, incorporating what she had learned over the summer. She also resumed her work in Henrik's workshop, finding that she had missed the tactile satisfaction of metalwork as much as she had missed her family. Balance, she told them, was important. Mind and hands both needed engagement. The winter pageant that year featured Marla directing the younger children's portion while also performing a reading of her own. She was clearly coming into her own as a leader, confident and capable, and Orla watched with fierce pride. This was what they had fought for, she and Henrik together. This moment, this girl, this future. After the pageant, as they walked home through crystalline snow, Marla spoke thoughtfully. "I think I want to become a teacher, eventually, after I have learned as much as I can." "You would be an excellent teacher," Orla said. "You already are in many ways," Henrik added. "You have been helping the younger children with their reading for years. I want to teach somewhere like here. Somewhere on the frontier where children might not have access otherwise. I want to make sure students like me, who do not fit the usual mold, have opportunities." She glanced at her parents. "Is that foolish?" "It is the opposite of foolish," Henrik said firmly. "It is noble and necessary. And we will support you every step of the way." That night, after Marla had gone to bed, Orla and Henrik sat together in their usual spot by the fire. The years had etched themselves gently on both of them, silver threading Henrik's beard, fine lines appearing at the corners of Orla's eyes. But the core of what they were to each other remained unchanged, steady and deep. "She's going to leave us eventually," Orla said quietly. "Not abandon us, but leave to build her own life, and I am going to have to let her go." "We will let her go together," Henrik said. "Just like we have done everything else, together. I could not have done this alone, any of it." Orla turned to face him. "You gave us not just your name and protection, but your whole heart. I need you to know how much that means. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning again. You and Marla both. I am the one who should be grateful. Then we are both grateful and both lucky, and that is how it should be." They kissed, tender and familiar, and then simply held each other as the fire burned down. Outside, the winter night was cold and clear, but inside there was warmth and love and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived together. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Marla grew into a young woman, tall and strong, her small tusks no longer a source of self-consciousness, but simply part of who she was. She excelled in her studies, earned a place at the regional academy for full-time attendance when she turned 15, and prepared to leave home with a mixture of excitement and bittersweet reluctance. The night before her departure, the three of them stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing. Marla told them about her hopes for the future, her dreams of returning to teach on the frontier, her determination to make them proud. Henrik told her she had already done that 1,000 times over. Orla simply held her daughter's hand and tried to memorize every detail of this moment, knowing that when Marla left in the morning, a chapter of their lives would close forever. But closure was not ending, Orla reminded herself. It was transformation. Marla leaving home did not mean they lost her. It meant they had succeeded in raising a capable, compassionate young woman ready to meet the world on her own terms. In the morning, they accompanied Marla to the coach station. Her trunk was loaded, her supplies checked and double-checked. She hugged Orla first, long and tight, whispering thank you against her mother's shoulder. Then she turned to Henrik, and he pulled her close with the fierce tenderness of a man who had claimed this child as his own and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Make good choices," he said roughly. "Work hard, write to us often, and remember you always have a home here no matter what." "I will make you proud, Papa." The words still had the power to make Henrik's eyes shine. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and stepped back. Marla climbed into the coach, waved from the window, and then the driver called to the horses and she was moving away, disappearing down the road into her future. Orla leaned against Henrik, and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stood together until the coach was long out of sight. "The cabin is going to be very quiet," Orla said eventually. "It is, but we still have each other. Always." They walked home slowly, neither in a rush to face the empty space where Marla's presence had been. But when they arrived, the cabin did not feel as desolate as Orla had feared. It felt peaceful, a place where two people who loved each other could rest and plan and dream about what came next. Over the following years, Marla returned home during breaks, each visit a gift. She completed her studies with honors, secured a teaching position at a newly established frontier school 2 territories over, and threw herself into the work with characteristic determination. Her letters described students from all backgrounds, including several orc and half-orc children, and the satisfaction of helping them discover their own potential. Orla and Henrik grew older, their lives settling into comfortable rhythms. Henrik's arthritis eventually forced him to take on an apprentice to handle the heaviest forge work, and Orla reduced her washing and mending as younger women took over the trade. They spent their days working at a gentler pace, visiting with friends and neighbors, enjoying the peaceful prosperity of a settlement that had grown from rough frontier outpost to established town. Other families, hearing about Marla's success, began sending their own children to the academies and teaching colleges. The second generation of frontier settlers was better educated and more open-minded than the first, and the changes they wrought continued to ripple outward. On a bright spring morning, when Orla was well into her 40s and Henrik's hair had gone completely silver, a coach arrived in town bearing familiar cargo. Marla stepped down, no longer the gangly adolescent who had left but a composed woman in her mid-20s, confidence evident in every line of her body. Behind her came a young man, orc-blooded like Marla herself, with intelligent eyes and a warm smile. "Mama, Papa, this is Tavin," Marla said, her voice bright with happiness. "He teaches mathematics at my school. We wanted you to meet him." Over the next few days, as they got to know Tavin and saw the way he looked at Marla, the way she bloomed in his presence, Orla understood that another transformation was unfolding. Her daughter had found her own partner, her own path to building a family. The cycle continued, each generation learning from the last and moving forward into unknown territory. The wedding took place that summer in the same chapel where Orla and Henrik had exchanged vows more than a decade earlier. Marla wore green to honor her orc heritage, flowers woven into her dark hair, her face radiant. Tavin stood beside her, solid and sincere, and when they spoke their vows, Orla wept openly, not from sadness but from overwhelming joy. At the celebration afterward, as the entire town turned out to honor their daughter, Henrik pulled Orla aside. "Remember when you knocked on my forge door asking for help with one school event?" he said. "I remember thinking you would refuse, that I was foolish to even ask. I almost did refuse. I was so deep in grief and isolation that I could barely see past my own misery." He cupped her face in his weathered hands. "But something made me say yes. Maybe Alina's ghost, maybe just the look in your eyes, and that one decision changed everything." "You changed everything," Orla corrected. "You stayed when you did not have to. You fought for us when no one else would. You loved us when we were strangers. And you let me back into life when I thought I was finished with it." Henrik kissed her forehead. "We did this together. Built this life, raised this remarkable daughter, changed this town. Together." They stood at the edge of the celebration, watching Marla dance with her new husband, watching the community they had helped shape celebrate around them. The journey from that first desperate request to this moment of joy had been long and often difficult, but every step had been worth it. Orla thought about the orc woman she had been 15 years ago, alone and afraid, asking a stranger for a kindness she had no right to expect. She thought about the man who had said yes against all logic, who had kept saying yes in 100 different ways until yes became simply the way they lived. She thought about the daughter they had raised together, now beginning her own adventure with courage and hope. And she thought about the future, whatever it might hold, knowing that as long as she and Henrik faced it together, they could weather anything. "We should dance," Henrik said, offering his hand. Orla took it, as she had taken it that first afternoon at the school family day, as she had taken it at their wedding, as she had taken it through all the years between. They moved onto the improvised dance floor, and the music swelled around them, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold. It was not the ending Orla had imagined when she first knocked on the blacksmith's door. It was infinitely better. A life built not on necessity but on choice, on love freely given and returned. A family forged not by blood alone but by commitment and daily acts of kindness. A community transformed by the simple radical act of seeing each other as human, regardless of skin or tusks or origin. The orc mother had needed a father for one school event. The man had stayed for everyone after, and in staying had become so much more than she had dared to dream possible. Together they had built something that would outlast them both, a legacy not of wealth or power, but of love and dignity, and the stubborn insistence that everyone deserved a place to belong. As the music played and the celebration continued into the warm night, Orla looked at her daughter, at her husband, at the gathered community, and felt complete. The journey had been long, but she had arrived somewhere better than she had known to hope for, and the man beside her had made all the difference. That night, long after the celebration ended and they had returned to their quiet cabin, Orla and Henrik sat together in their familiar spot. No words were necessary. They had said everything that mattered over years of living side by side, choosing each other again and again in ways both grand and mundane. The fire burned low. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. And two people who had found each other in loneliness and built a life together in courage held hands in the darkness and knew themselves blessed. Somewhere in the frontier territories, in a town that had learned to see past prejudice to the people beneath, the forge still stood next to the small cabin, where an orc woman and a human man had once been strangers. Now they were everything to each other, and the light that shone from their windows was a beacon promising that love could triumph over fear. That family was what you made of it, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was say yes when someone asked for help. The story that had begun with one desperate request and one unlikely agreement had become a testament to the power of showing up, of staying, of choosing connection over isolation. And in that testament, countless others would find courage to build their own bridges, forge their own families, and create their own futures where love mattered more than the accidents of birth. The orc mother and the man who stayed for every school event after the first had written their own happily ever after, one day at a time, and it would endure long past the last ember in the forge, long past the final star fading from the sky. Love endured, family endured, hope endured. And that was enough. That was everything.